Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Encompas Mental Health and Communication series. I am Louise Hanson, and on behalf of the Encompas team, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today in what is the first of a three-part series on sleep. And just as a reminder, today's session and the next two are 75 minutes long, and I mention that because they're typically 60. So the session today will end in 75 minutes. Now, this is an important topic when considering one's overall health and well-being. And so we really wanted to provide ample opportunity to deliver meaningful content for all of you. And so today we are really pleased to introduce Dr. Glenn Landry. Dr. Landry is a sleep scientist with over 20 years of study and experience in this important field. He completed his graduate research at Simon Fraser University and then focused his research efforts on sleep, aging, and cognition at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Landry is now in private practice as a sleep coach and educator, and I have heard him describe himself as a sleep geek. He is a true expert and a scientist, and he does an amazing job of translating sleep and the science of sleep into meaningful and understandable concepts that really will allow all of us to address our sleep challenges. And finally, just by way of introduction to Dr. Landry, I wanted to say that he has done a tremendous amount of beneficial work with first responders, and so brings this knowledge and expertise as well into his sessions with us. So we're really pleased to have him sharing his expertise. And so Dr. Landry, just before I turn it over to you, just a couple of housekeeping points. We have purposely disabled cameras and microphones within this series so that everyone can participate anonymously. We are recording the presentation and we will post it on the Encompas site to enable access for those who may have missed it or those who are interested in watching it again. And I think that will be many of you because it's filled with fabulous information. We're going to ask that questions be not held to the end, but Dr. Landry will answer questions at the end. And as you have questions, though, you can use the Q&A chat, and those questions will come only to this Encompas team, and I will read them out to Dr. Landry to ensure anonymity as those questions get asked. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Landry and say that we're thrilled to have you here. So welcome.
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Let's see if I can get my screen shared. Looks like it's sharing correctly. Can you see it?
I can see you, yeah.
Okay, great. So again, thanks for the kind introduction. Just to add a little bit more background, so I've been studying circadian rhythms and sleep for over 25 years now. And I came to the field honestly because as a teen, I couldn't sleep. And so my routine was typically over time, I learned that, I had dutiful parents. They wanted me to be in bed by, 10:30, but I just couldn't fall asleep. I would, in the beginning, I would toss and turn and get really frustrated. But eventually I learned that, that was a really highly productive time for me. And so I would do my homework late at night. I'd get up, I'd watch TV. When I became driving age, I would go out. My parents would fall asleep around 11:30, and they were, hardworking professionals. They would sleep hard. I knew that I had until about 4:30 before they would begin to stir. And so my typical routine was to be up until about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. And then finally I'd be able to get to sleep. And obviously 7 a.m., 8 a.m. wake up was incredibly difficult for me. Eventually I got a little more control of my schedule. So I would get up, I would act like I was going to be starting my day, and then my parents would get off to work and I'd get back into bed and sleep for a few more hours, and usually would, arrive at school. This is high school years now. I'd arrive at school around 11:30. I did really well in school, so my teachers didn't see me as a problem student in that respect. And so I was able to, work around the sleep problem. It wasn't until I started university and I took a course from a world-renowned expert in circadian rhythms and sleep. His name's Dr. Ralph Misselberger. And honestly, that was life-changing moment number one. I joined his lab shortly after taking his course because I became so fascinated in a subject that you're going to learn about in this series called circadian rhythms. Think of it as daily biological rhythms. We have daytime physiology, biology, and behavior. We have nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. And those two things need to be kept separate in time because they're incompatible processes. And what Ralph taught me is how to take control of my circadian rhythms, which allowed me to take control of my sleep. And so I was able to actually get to sleep eventually at a time that worked best for me. The challenge in the early days was really that while I had control of my course schedule, final exams I had no control over. And so final exams that were scheduled for 8:30 would have been a real problem for me until I learned how to take control of my circadian rhythms and get the sleep I need. So that was life-changing moment number one. Life-changing moment number two for me was after I finished my undergrad and honors degree in Ralph's lab, I moved back to live with my parents because my grandparents had moved in to live with them, and my grandfather had Alzheimer's disease. And to be honest with you, my grandmother had hid it from the family for well over a decade, obviously. And the caregiver burden had taken such a severe toll on her that it really accelerated her demise. And eventually, after she had passed, my grandfather became, increasingly difficult to care for. And my dad and I had to alternate shifts. The reason is because my grandfather would wake up at night every hour. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. He would wake up every hour. And as long as someone was in bed with him, he'd come around the bed, he'd tuck us in, and he'd give us a kiss on the cheek, and then he'd get back into bed. But if nobody was in bed with him, he would roam the house or even leave the house. And so that was a real challenge. And so he became this incredible sleep depriver for my father and I. We would alternate nights, and he would wake us up every hour on the hour. And so that had a profound impact on our ability to perform during the day. And so we became really shift workers. And as you'll learn later in this talk, we're all shift workers because sleep is the first thing we sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance. But that life-changing moment number two really changed the course of my career in that I became really obsessed with sleep, to be honest with you. And in particular, I was interested in the process of normal cognitive aging, as well as normal changes in sleep health as a function of aging, and what the relationship was between those two things. And you're going to learn all about that in this series. So that's really what brought me to this field. And so to talk a little bit more about this series, that it's a series of 3 talks. Today's talk is all about why sleep is so important, why it matters, and why we need to really do a better job of prioritizing sleep in our society. In the second talk, this one will be on May 25th, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, again, 75 minutes, as Louise was saying. This talk will focus on why can't I sleep? What are the things that are stopping me from getting the sleep I know I need? And then we'll finish the series with interventions that can help you. Think of it as tips, tools, and strategies, taking the knowledge from the previous 2 talks and then applying it so that you can actually improve your sleep health. And so that third talk will be on June 22nd. So without further ado, let's really dive into, why sleep is so important. And I realize we've been talking and facing COVID-19 for a long time, and we're quite frankly exhausted, and we don't want to talk about it anymore. But what I want you to understand, it's not going away anytime soon. and it's going to continue to mutate and evolve. And so it will be this new normal in terms of there is going to be this challenge that we have to overcome. And what the positive message that I have for you here is that healthy sleep can combat COVID-19. So I'm going to take you through a bit of science just to help you understand the importance of your sleep health in relation to combating COVID-19. So when we're faced with a pandemic, and if we're going to combat this pandemic, the first thing we need to understand is reproduction rate. And that's just simply the speed at which the disease spreads throughout a population. And it's really a function of two things. The transmission rate, that's the ease with which it's able to spread from person to person. And then the other factor is the recovery rate. And that's something that we want to be able to improve, because the faster someone recovers from, say, COVID-19 in this example, the less chance that they have of spreading it on. And so that's the relationship, that's the formula, if you will. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because we want to address COVID-19 by reducing the reproduction rate. And that can be done in sleep has a profound impact on reproduction rate because it can decrease transmission rate. And I'll show you how in a moment. And it can also increase recovery rate. And so let's dive into this. So here's a study that was done. Now, this is done some time ago, and it wasn't done with COVID-19, but I want you to understand the mechanisms are all the same. So they do translate to COVID-19. In this case, this was university age college students that were volunteering to be part of a study. And what they did is they exposed these college students to a different virus. They were exposed to the rhinovirus, think common cold. So they used a nasal spray. So what we're looking at here is an artificial environment where there's 100% exposure rate. But before exposure, what they did is they tracked the sleep health of all of the participants. And what we see, and this is remarkable, but what we see is that the individuals during the couple of weeks prior to exposure, the individuals that were getting very little sleep, less than 5 hours of sleep on it, this is actigraph, so actual sleep each night over a couple of weeks prior to exposure, what you can see is that the individuals that had the least amount of sleep, they actually converted and got the cold at a much, much higher rate than individuals that were getting better sleep. Look at this group here, greater than 7 hours of actual sleep each night, a dramatic reduction in their risk of actually getting the cold. And now I'm going to highlight a couple here. This matters because it really reflects the general population. We know from epidemiological studies as well as aggregate data of Fitbit data that I'll show you in a few minutes. We know that the average individual is getting less than 7 hours of actual sleep society-wide. In fact, they're probably getting even just a bit more than 6 to 6.5 hours of actual sleep on a nightly basis. And so if we were to take that group and we were to have them get 7 hours actual, so improve their sleep by an hour, we could get up to 20% reduction in the risk of infection. And again, these numbers would translate for COVID as well because the mechanisms are identical. Another group of interest is the shift worker population. In this group, we know, again, epidemiological studies show that they're getting between 5 and 6 hours of actual sleep on a nightly basis. And so if we were to take that shift worker population and get them to 7 hours actual sleep, we could get up to a 30% reduction in their risk of infection. This could result in dramatic changes in risk. Now, that was the transmission rate that we're talking about, how sleep could reduce transmission rate. Now, we have a short window here for the talk, so I'm not going to take you through all of the immune system functions here, but what I want you to take away from this slide is that healthy sleep increases recovery rate because it has an impact on all of these immune system functions that drive recovery rate. So what I'm saying here is that we need to promote healthy sleep to combat COVID-19. We are faced with an ongoing challenge that is COVID-19, and if we're going to combat it, then we need to think beyond just simple vaccines and personal protective equipment. Don't get me wrong, vaccinations are critical, and PPE is also important to reduce the risk. But what I'm saying is that there's an opportunity that we are missing right now, and that is to promote better sleep health population-wide so that we can actually improve our immune system status and be able to better fight, and this would be any mutation of COVID-19 and in fact, any pathogen. If we actually address our sleep health needs, we can improve our overall health and performance. And that leads me to, the epidemiological studies and the aggregate Fitbit data, millions of users around the world. What it shows us is that we're all sleep deprived. In fact, I would go so far as to say that we are all shift workers. Again, because as I said earlier, sleep is the first thing that we sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance. And what that means is our sleep schedule changes from night to night and week to week, depending on, whatever our schedule demands. We now have the tools to get better insight. Each individual has access to their own sleep lab, if you will. Fitbit data is the data that I use because the sleep staging that Fitbit provides is best in class. I realize that Oura Ring and Garmin and Apple Watch, they provide their own versions of sleep tracking. But as you're going to see later in talks 2 and 3, Fitbit data provides us insight into what the polysomnography would be as if you were in the sleep lab. Their staging is more accurate. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's far from perfect, but it provides us with coachable data where we can have an intervention and track change over time and course correct based on that data. So that's what's critical. And now, as I had said, we're all shift workers. Well, here is, and this data maps very well with epidemiological studies around the world. But what you can see is that the average Fitbit data, the average Fitbit user is going to bed around 11:30, round numbers here, and getting up around 7:30. And so an 8-hour sleep window. So that user would think, okay, well, I'm following what I'm supposed to do. The best practice guidelines from sleep experts. This is consensus now. Sleep experts around the world would say that the average individual, the average adult, needs 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep each night. And so the average Fitbit user would say, well, I'm in bed for 8 hours. That's got to be enough. But what you're going to see here is that the actual time of sleep for the average Fitbit user, again, aggregate data on millions of users around the world, the average Fitbit user is getting about 6 hours and 38 minutes, not 7, which is the minimum. In fact, they're far below that minimum, and this is on a night-to-night basis. So what I'm showing you here is that as a society, we're not getting enough sleep. What that means is that we are accelerating our aging. When we don't get the sleep we need, we are engaging the sympathetic nervous system. Think of it as our fight or flight response. We're programmed for a 16-hour waking day and an 8-hour sleep window. to get at least 7 hours of actual sleep. And when we don't get that 7 hours of actual sleep, it accelerates aging, increasing our risk of cardiovascular disease, inflammation, obesity, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and cancer. In fact, in 2010, the World Health Organization, after a thorough review of the science, determined that shift work that results in circadian dysregulation. And what I mean by circadian dysregulation is turning our nights into days and our days into nights. When we do that, it actually causes cancer. We'll learn a little bit more about why in the talks to come. The key takeaway is that if you aren't getting 7 hours of actual sleep each night, you are accelerating your aging. The point here is that if you want to make the most of your sleep window, your brain and your body must be ready for sleep at the time you go to sleep. And that's really why when we are shifting our sleep schedule, it's really what's driving that poor sleep efficiency, not getting as much sleep as we would want, even though we're giving ourselves, say, an 8-hour sleep window. So the reason that we're accelerating aging is because wakefulness is actually toxic. Now, this is consensus science that I'm showing you here, but what we're going to do is we're going to look at this from the hours, from the point that we wake up, the hours of sustained wakefulness. The brain is like an engine, and it's producing exhaust. From the point that we wake up, this exhaust is accumulating around the neurons in our brain, but it's also producing exhaust throughout all of the tissues through our brain and our body. As I mentioned earlier, we are pre-programmed for a 16-hour waking day. So for those 16 hours, our brain is able to compensate for that toxicity that's building up. But when we go beyond that 16 hours, sustaining wakefulness for longer periods of time than we're actually designed, then there are these subtle at first changes that happen. Our brain isn't able to compensate any longer. And the reason for that is quite simply that sleep washes our brain of the day's waste. When we go to sleep, as long as we are getting the 8-hour sleep window and at least 7 hours of sustained healthy sleep, actual sleep, the brain is well washed by the time morning comes along, and as well as the body. And what that does is it results in our ability to start the next day with a clean slate, if you will. But what happens if we aren't getting 7 hours actual each night? Well, we're producing this exhaust and it's not having the ability to wash away. Remember, again, the brain is like an engine. It's producing exhaust around our neurons and, in fact, all throughout our body. And we have this mechanism to wash away that toxicity. In the event that we don't get 7 hours actual sleep, let's say that we're only getting 6. Well, what happens is that we begin to accumulate this toxicity. Now, what you're doing is you're looking at this from the side of the brain, and this is the frontal cortex. This prefrontal cortex is critical. It is the CEO of the brain. I'll show you on slides to come why that's so important. But each successive night that we go without getting the sleep we need, we begin building up this debt, this accumulation of toxicity. Again, it's like a tsunami that builds from the front of the brain and moves its way back. And this matters because these neurons here are the neurons that drive a particular stage of sleep called slow wave sleep. And that is the sleep that washes our brain. So in Fitbit data, it's called deep sleep. That's the sleep that washes the brain of the day's waste. And so what we have here is over time, and let me be clear, this is a decades-long process. This is not, an immediate effect. The brain has compensatory mechanisms to be able to compensate for long periods of time. So you may actually, have the perception that you can function well on 4 or 5 hours sleep on a nightly basis, but make no mistake, you are borrowing from your health and wealth of your retirement. And so this part of the brain is critical, not just because it drives slow wave sleep, but because it's the CEO of the brain. So let's look at this in terms of it is a brake pedal that is responsible for reason, logic, and decision making. Absolutely critical for us to be able to be at our best. If we allow toxicity to build up in this part of the brain, that brake pedal is no longer functioning as well as it should be. And there are two key gas pedals that go unchecked when we don't get the sleep we need. The first, and I'm simplifying here, the first is the emotional center of the brain. Think the amygdala. And what happens is that's the part of the brain that is emotionally reactive to our environment. When we're sleep deprived, this gas pedal here goes unchecked, unbraked. What I mean by that is think of something that might be a little funny. When we're sleep deprived, it could become hilarious. Conversely, things that would be a nuisance, a small irritation, become almost unbearable when we're sleep deprived. Think of it as our ability to control our emotions, our anger management, if you will. When we're sleep deprived, it is impaired. Now, for the parents in the room, think to when your child was younger. You might have had your child at the mall, and they wanted something desperately. And you just couldn't give it to them at that time, and they pitch a fit. Now, in that case, we're not immediately calling psych services because they're having a fit or a mental breakdown, because we know that our child is tired. Our child needs a nap. The interesting thing is that we understood that intuitively as parents. Our children need naps, and when they don't get the nap they need, they become hyper emotional. What's interesting is that we lose that connection as adults. As adults, we still need our sleep. And when we don't get it, we become emotionally reactive. Our anger management is impaired. That's one gas pedal. Another gas pedal is our reward center of the brain. Again, simplifying here, calling it the striatum. That's our adrenaline junkie, our inner adrenaline junkie. And when we're sleep deprived, once again, the CEO of the brain is offline and isn't able to control that risk-seeking behavior. In fact, consensus science now shows, both in the lab and in the real world, that when we are sleep deprived, it completely alters our risk-reward analysis, our cost-benefit analysis. Our ability to evaluate the situation and determine our best decision or best path forward is impaired when we're sleep deprived. And this is why what we see is the individual will tend to overestimate the benefit of a given decision and underestimate the risk associated with that. So we will tend to take riskier decisions because we don't see them as risky anymore. And it's worth that risk because we're absolutely certain that something good is going to come of our actions. Now that goes against all of our training. And what I want you to understand here, and I'll show you in some slides to come, we aren't who we are trained to be when we're sleep deprived. That has a dramatic impact on our ability to follow our training and to be able to execute as we're intended to. All right, so having covered that, we've looked at why sleep is so important. But now let's talk about what that sleep really is. What is elite sleep? Well, here you're getting a look into, well, this is my Fitbit sleep stages data, and it shouldn't be a surprise to you. Trained professional work very, very hard on my sleep. The first thing you'll notice is that I'm going to bed, and this is typical data for me. I'm going to bed around 10 o'clock, and I'm getting up at 7 in the morning. Now, that's a longer sleep window than we've been talking about. That's a 9-hour sleep window, and I'll just explain why. So as I mentioned earlier, life-changing moment number 2, what we discovered is that we have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. It's a gene that predisposes us to Alzheimer's disease, and in fact, accelerates the rate at which we would get there. And the reason that I spend so much time and effort on making sure that I am an elite sleeper is because I know from the science that if I am one of the world's best sleepers and truly an elite sleeper, the best 10% of sleepers, it negates the impact of this gene that I have. It's as though I don't have that gene at all. So what I'm telling you there is that we've heard the expression that biology is destiny. What I'm telling you is that what we do in our lives has an impact on the way that our genes play out. This is called epigenetics. And so by me making sure that I protect my sleep and that I get the sleep I need so that I am washing my brain well and using that well-washed brain to consolidate learning and memory. By doing that, I negate this risk for Alzheimer's disease. And that's my objective. And so to get a deeper dive into what this elite sleep is, the first thing I want you to notice is that when I go to sleep, I fall quickly into sleep. And in particular, I'm getting into this stage of deep sleep that I mentioned earlier. That's the sleep that washes the brain. In fact, if you break the sleep window into 2 halves, you can see that front half, I spend a majority of my time in non-REM sleep here. That's non-REM sleep is the light and the deep sleep. I spend the majority of my time getting deep sleep, alternating with brief bouts at first of REM sleep and then back into non-REM sleep and then back into REM. And this alternates every 90 minutes or so. And then when we look at the second half of sleep, you can see that I spend much more time then alternating between light sleep and increasing lengths of REM sleep. The back half has a lot of REM sleep. Now, the reason for this and why staging matters, this is called sleep architecture. The reason this matters is that what I'm really doing here is I am washing my brain in the front half, and then I am using that well-washed brain to consolidate learning and memory, to process trauma and build resilience. So just to take you a little bit more into what these stages do. Deep sleep, as I mentioned earlier, washes the brain. Think of it as the restoration, the repair cycle. It's part of growth and immune system functioning, driving my overall physical and mental health. And then in the back half, light sleep is a misnomer. It's not poor sleep necessarily. Light sleep is a stage of sleep that it's much easier to wake someone up out of that stage of sleep in comparison to, say, deep sleep or REM. And so that's where light sleep gets its name. Light sleep is a critical stage of sleep because it processes our day. No 2 days are the same. What happens during light sleep is we prioritize the items that must be remembered. They're critical for future success. So they get a tag that says, remember this. The rest of it is just noise and we can forget about this. We're inundated with information, but the salient information, the information that's important for future success gets tagged. That's part of light sleep. Another thing that light sleep does is it plays a role in consolidation of learning and memory, a specific type of memory called skill acquisition, if you will. Think of it as muscle memory, those routines and those sequencing that we need to do without thinking. So think of learning how to play an instrument or learning how to pitch a fastball versus a curveball. All of this muscle memory, riding a bike, blowing a bubble, all of this muscle memory needs to be consolidated. In order for us to be able to act without thinking, automatic processing, if you will, that's light sleep. REM sleep is critical for a different kind of consolidation of learning and memory. It's for knowledge acquisition and being able to recall things quickly, being able to learn important facts, figures, dates. That's REM sleep. But REM sleep also plays a role in processing trauma, removing the negative emotional tag that's associated with a new learning event. Think of it as a virus scan that's happening each night. For a computer, when it's running that virus scan, if something interrupts that virus scan, then it gets stuck in a loop and it'll continue to reprocess and reprocess and reprocess. In the same way, if we're not getting the REM sleep we need, our ability to remove an negative emotional tag from a traumatic event is impaired, and this could lead to recurring nightmares or the inability to overcome that trauma. So it's critical that we get REM sleep to process that trauma and to build resilience. We talk about resiliency training. We talk about how we have this backpack and that every traumatic event is a rock that is held in this backpack. And we want to be able to unload that backpack on a nightly basis. REM sleep is critical for that. All right, so what we really want to shoot for, and we'll talk about this more in talks 2 and 3, but what we really want to shoot for is sustained sleep health so that we can get our deep sleep at the front and then use that well-washed brain in the back half. In order to get this sleep, you need to have strong circadian regulation. And so we'll cover that now a little bit, but we will be looking at this in a deeper dive when we're talking about why we can't sleep and what we need to do about it in talks 2 and talk 3. So circadian rhythms, I mentioned this briefly already, but they are daily biological rhythms. Think daytime physiology, biology, and behavior, and nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. And it's critical that we keep those things separate in time because they are incompatible processes. If we want to be elite in whichever domain that we've chosen for ourselves, we need to first become elite sleepers because sleep health status impacts every aspect of human health and performance. And in order to do that, we need to address circadian rhythms. How many of these circadian rhythms do we have? We have thousands of them. The reason for this is because we have clocks all throughout our brain and our body. In fact, an individual skin cell has a clock. And these clocks all need to be synchronized. They need to all be telling the same time. And so we have a pacemaker. We actually have 2, but here I'm showing you the master circadian pacemaker. It's synchronized to the solar day-night cycle. And so this pacemaker, we call it the light entrainable pacemaker, but it's synchronized to our light exposure profile. But we have other pacemakers throughout our brain and body, and they are synchronized to a number of important time cues. You could think of them as the reward entrainable pacemaker, synchronized to our meal times, our physical activity profile, and anything that is a reward stimuli. I'm going to cover a couple of circadian rhythms that are critical and will be a big part of the intervention moving forward. Melatonin we have a circadian melatonin rhythm, and it begins to rise a couple of hours before our normal bedtime. And then it reaches a peak in the middle of our sleep window, and then it falls just before our daytime begins, our normal daytime, and it stays at low levels for the rest of the day. Now, this is a healthy circadian rhythm for melatonin, and it's important because melatonin plays a critical role preparing our brain and body for sleep. It prepares the brain for sleep by helping in the process of turning off the wake promoting areas of the brain and turning on the sleep promoting areas of the brain. But it also plays a role in fighting cancer. We talked earlier about the World Health Organization and how they determined that shift work that causes circadian dysregulation causes cancer. Well, one of the mechanisms that is now understood to be a cancer promoting mechanism is impairing the circadian rhythm of melatonin, decreasing melatonin at night as a function of getting light at night. That turns off melatonin profile, and we produce cancer cells as a normal course of daily living. And we have mechanisms that are there to identify the cancer cell, target it for destruction, destroy it, and then remove the waste. And melatonin plays a role in that process. So shift workers that are getting too much light at night, that have circadian dysregulation, are impairing their cancer fighting. Now, that's just one of the mechanisms that's driving increased risk of cancer for shift workers. We also see this in older adults. This is a key driver. We'll talk more about it in the talks to come. Another circadian rhythm that I want you to be aware of is the core body temperature rhythm. And as we go through these talks, you'll learn more and more about the importance of your core body temperature rhythm. But just to start, what I want you to see, this is 2 days and nights. Our body temperature rhythm reaches its lowest point here a couple of hours, 2-3 hours before our normal wake up time. And then it begins rising before we wake up. And it continues rising until this dip in the mid-afternoon. We call this the mid-afternoon lull. And then you see that after that lull, the core body temperature begins rising again, and it reaches a peak just before our normal bedtime. And then you can see the profile decreasing, a long, deep dive in our core body temperature rhythm until we're ready to begin our next day. And it's an important thing I want you to notice here is that our core body temperature in the time that we've been sleeping goes from its peak to its low in that 8-hour window that we're sleeping. Hopefully it's this 8-hour sleep window. So now let's understand what that core body temperature rhythm is linked to. Well, first, it's linked to our sleep drive. These 2 blue arrows here, what you can see is that after the core body temperature has peaked and it's then gone into a decline, shortly after that, what we can see is that this is associated with an increased sleep drive. And shortly after that, you'll see an impact in terms of our nighttime sleep. When we're reaching our body temperature minimum, that's a phase locked REM stage where we get a ton of our REM sleep tied to our body temperature rhythm, our core body temperature minimum, not here, but when it reaches its lowest point in the 24-hour cycle. Another important thing that I want you to notice is that our cognitive processing, our ability to respond to our environment and to solve problems, our ability to think quickly on our feet is impaired when our core body temperature rhythm has dipped. So what we see here, this is the mid-afternoon lull. This is the time, think between 1 and 4 p.m. when people are very often reaching for stimulants like coffee or cigarettes, anything to get them through that lull. They feel the lull. They know they're not functioning at their best, and so they're trying to get stimulants. That's a risk zone. We'll see this in the slide to come. Another more potent cognitive risk zone is right here, the core body temperature minimum. Think about 12 hours later. Think the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. window. In that range, what we see is that the brain is actually pre-programmed. As I mentioned here, the brain's pre-programmed to be getting REM. And so when we're awake during this time, it's actually a time when our brain is programmed for sleep. And so we have sleep intrusions. It's very difficult to stay awake. It's very difficult to maintain our situational awareness, our vigilance. So these are two risk zones that we want to pay close attention to. In terms of fatigue risk management, we want to be very much aware of our circadian rhythm, as well as our core body temperature rhythm in particular, because that is going to give us an identification of two zones of risk. You don't want to be doing safety critical tasks during these two times. All right, as best as you can avoid it. All right, so now we're talking about these two danger zones, and I want to show you how they play out both in the lab as well as the real world. So here is a laboratory environment. Individual comes into the lab and they do a simple task. It's called the psychomotor vigilance task. It can be as simple as just looking at a computer screen that has a green light and a red light. And their task is just to click the mouse button as soon as a green light turns red. And then once they click that mouse button, the red light will turn back to green. So a very, very simple task. And what you can see here is from the point that the individual comes into the lab for that period of time throughout the day, they're able to perform that task without any errors. No problem, very simple task. Then they sleep in the lab and they begin their second day in the lab. And here you can see the second day, no problem, being able to perform the task. But then there's a spike because they begin a 64-hour sleep deprivation. And here we see this danger zone play out where there's a spike. Their ability to maintain psychomotor vigilance or be able to attend is impaired. And so they begin to make errors quite frequently. And then after a period of time, the error rate decreases, not quite to baseline level, but it improves until it spikes once again. And as I mentioned earlier, it is this core body temperature minimum that is this marker of dramatic impairment in their ability to do the task. Our situational awareness, our ability to stay vigilant is dramatically impaired at these two windows. This actually is the equivalent of having drunk alcohol. So we call this a blood alcohol equivalent impairment. And we can do this same using a different a driving simulator. You can look at what the impairments are like. And so what I want you to see here is that, again, remember, we're programmed for a 16-hour waking day. When we go beyond that programming, we begin to have impairments that can be objectively measured. In fact, when we go to 17 and 18 hours of sustained wakefulness without sleeping or napping, the blood alcohol equivalent impairment is 0.05. When we go beyond that and we get into 19 and 20 hours of sustained wakefulness, our blood alcohol equivalent is 0.08. When we go beyond 21 hours of sustained wakefulness, our blood alcohol equivalent impairment is 0.10. We see this play out in terms of when we control for all other confounding variables, when we normalize and we look at transport, single vehicle transport accidents, we see the same thing on the road. We see a spike in accidents that are associated with the core body temperature minimum. So that is that danger zone that I've been talking about, 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., a time when the brain is programmed for sleep and is normally getting REM sleep. But there's this other spike right here, and that is the mid-afternoon lull. And so what I'm telling you here is that this zone, this danger zone, is predictable. And if we can predict when the danger is, we can actually do things to mitigate that risk. Let's see how this plays out in terms of industrial accidents. So here's one example. This is 3 Mile Island. And what happened in this example, and Netflix did an expose of this, you can get it on Netflix. But essentially what happened is individuals in the control room, they were unable to go beyond their standard operating procedures and think creatively because they were sleep deprived. The reactor was beginning to overheat. They identified that correctly. But what happened is that they followed their procedures and they opened a valve that was intended to cool that reactor. But what they didn't do is identify that the valve was stuck. So they opened the valve, but the reactor wasn't cooling. And they didn't quickly identify that and fix that stuck valve. And that essentially cooked the reactor. Their ability to think beyond the SOP, the ability to think beyond their training and be creative so that they could solve the problem, was impaired because they were sleep deprived. Earlier, I talked about decision-making and that we have a tendency to underestimate the risk and overestimate the reward of a given decision when we're sleep deprived. And NASA management was made aware of a fault in their O-rings for the Challenger or for the space shuttle. And they determined, they knew that the O-rings in cold temperatures wouldn't function as well. But they determined that this was a risk that they were willing to take to stay on schedule because the likelihood of a launch in cold temperatures wasn't as likely to be a factor. And eventually it became a factor. They underestimated the risk and they overestimated the importance of staying on schedule. And rather than pause launch and fix the O-ring problem, they figured that it wouldn't actually play out. And unfortunately, it did. Chernobyl. This was simply a math error. The engineers were testing nuclear cake recipes, and it was just simply a math error where they put too much in and they cooked the reactor. They were sleep deprived and they weren't able to make the right calculations. Again, it's a cognitive impairment. Exxon Valdez, this is situational awareness. After staying up more than 18 hours, a fatigued third mate came on duty. And because they had gone beyond the programming in terms of their sleep and sustained wakefulness, they actually just simply lost situational awareness and put themselves in the wrong location on the navigational chart. Even though this was, well-charted territory, the third mate just made an error and ran the Exxon Valdez aground. Here's another example of poor decision-making. So in this case, this is an American Airlines Flight 1420 that crashed in a severe storm during landing. Determined to be pilot error. These pilots were nearing the end of their 14-hour duty shift, and they simply made an error in judgment when choosing to land in a severe thunderstorm. Now, what's interesting about this is that the NTSB does their investigation, and they have similarly trained pilots that go into a simulator and run the event over and over again with different pilots. None of the pilots in the simulator would have made the decision to land. Now, pilots on an ongoing basis have go, no-go decisions. And in this case, you know, the benefit of making sure that they land at the target airport is that they don't have additional costs associated with fuel or accommodations and inconvenience for their passengers. So certainly there's a motivation to make sure they get the bird down. But that motivation never supersedes the primary directive, which is to land safely. What's interesting here is that the weather was a known risk. The pilots determined that they would be able to land that aircraft, that the weather was severe, but they faced that before. They underestimated the risk of attempting the landing, and they overestimated the importance of landing. In this example, this is a train. The engineer fell asleep during a critical point. Lost situational awareness. Trains are heavy vehicles, and in this case, they have a set of flags or signals that, you know, warn them to begin slowing the train for an upcoming turn. And this train engineer simply missed that signal because of a sleep intrusion, fell asleep at a very unfortunate time, missed the signal, and then there was no way for the engineer to slow the train in time for the turn. After a subsequent investigation, it was determined that the engineer had sleep apnea. Even though he thought he was getting the sleep he needed because he was sleep apneic, he wasn't actually getting the restful sleep that he needed. And so that led to a chronic sleep debt that eventually resulted in a sleep intrusion at a very bad time. Think sleep intrusion, the lights are on, but nobody's home. They're awake, but none of the situational awareness is happening. So critical factors, just to summarize here, what we're looking at is that this is another example. This is the Hinton crash, where a freight train crashed into a passenger train in Hinton, Alberta. And what happened there is that likely the freight train engineers once again fell asleep. When we look at these disasters, there's lots of factors that lead to the disaster happening, but one of the factors is fatigue. A key driver of fatigue we know to be shift length, but really what we're talking about there is sustained wakefulness. Again, it gets back to we are programmed for a 16-hour waking day and an 8-hour sleep to wash away that day's toxicity. When we don't get that sleep, we are impaired. It's like a slow descending fog that at first we do not notice. So the individual is impaired but unaware of their impairment. In the similar way that, you know, the last person you want to ask whether they're safe to drive is the person that's been drinking, because they're drunk, they think they're good to go. It's the same thing when we're sleep deprived. And a key driver is something called sleep intrusions. As I mentioned earlier, the brain reaches a point where it can no longer sustain wakefulness. It literally reboots. And during that brief period when the lights are on but nobody's home, we lack any situational awareness at all. And time of day has a huge impact, because there are these risk zones that we can predict. The mid-afternoon lull, think 1 to 4 p.m., as well as the core body temperature minimum, the hours between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., somewhere in that. It depends on the individual, but these are the two primary risk zones that we need to be aware of. And then finally, a key driver, when we're sleep deprived, we are not who we are trained to be. Our ability to maintain situational awareness is impaired, but also our judgment is impaired. The ability to do risk versus reward assessment accurately, to make good decisions, to be who we are trained to be, is impaired when we are sleep deprived, chronically sleep deprived. And what I mean by chronically sleep deprived is just not getting 7 hours of actual sleep every night. All right, so we're going to open it up now to questions.
All right. Wow, that's a ton of great information. Thank you. So I'll just remind everybody to use the Q&A feature at the bottom for any questions. And we do have some here already, so I'll start with those. There's a question, Dr. Landry, about whether or not you're familiar with a book called Sleep Thieves. The individual here has said that it contains a plethora of sleep information and really helped to open their eyes around the
on the shelf behind me.
All right.
Yes. If you're interested in the topic, another book that you might be interested in is Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. Gets into a lot of the material that we cover in the, this talk as well as the two to come. But yes, definitely aware of the books.
Right. Thank you. The individual was also mentioning, just reflecting on listening to those World Health Organization findings and the linkage between cancer and shift work. Question here, I guess the question is, if you get sleep with medical assistance, does that count as good sleep?
It does not. So I'm assuming that the questioner is referring, when they say medical assistance, they're talking about sleep aids. And we are going to cover this in talk number 2 under why can't I sleep? But just to answer the question for now, the distinction is pharmacological sleep versus physiologically healthy sleep. And so what happens when we take drugs to help us fall asleep, it has an impact on our sleep architecture. And I'll just show you when I come up to the elite sleep slide. Just bear with me as I bring that up. So what happens is that sleep aids will promote one particular stage of sleep at the expense of other stages, because these stages are mutually exclusive. You can't be in deep sleep while at the same time being in REM. And so what happens when we take stimulants or drugs, and we cover this in talk 2, when we take these stimulants or drugs, in particular, any drug that has an impact on the neurotransmitter systems involved in sleep, it will drive an increase in one stage of sleep at the expense of another stage. And so we are accumulating a sleep debt when we take these drugs.
Is there any benefit? Is it any better than not sleeping?
That's a difficult question to answer. So the first thing, it depends on the case. But if the individual isn't getting any sleep whatsoever, say they're dealing with trauma or there's been an event that's driving that, then certainly, sleep aids do have a role. There's a place, a time and a place. But what I would want you to understand is that they're intended for use for 7 to 10 days at most. They're not intended to be used chronically. And so, whereas there could be a benefit for a brief period of time, they are not a long-term solution. Currently, they're being used as a long-term solution inappropriately.
Okay, thank you. So after 30 years of shift work and being sleep deprived, can the damage be reversed for Alzheimer's issues?
Absolutely. This is an important thing to mention, and thank you to the questioner. What I want you to understand first, I wouldn't come on and do a talk and start a series telling you just how important sleep is if there wasn't something that we could do. And, you know, as you mentioned, Louise, I've been working with first responders for a long time now. And, you know, the core tenet here is do no harm. It would be, you know, irresponsible of me to come on here and tell everybody that they needed something and then not be able to provide it. So you can absolutely improve your sleep health, and it isn't too late. To give you an example, when I did my postdoctoral fellowship at UBC, we were translating the science acquired from my PhD in the animal model and then applying it to the human model. And we've known for decades that sleep changes. This will be covered in our next talk in detail, but we've known for decades that sleep changes as a normal course of aging. In fact, if you took a young, healthy adult and had them sleep the way an older adult does, you would end up with, you know, accelerated aging, as I've talked about. But what we discovered is that you can take an older adult that's not sleeping well, improve their sleep health, and have them restore their overall health and wellness. And so, and the average age for that group was 88. So please stay tuned for talk number 2. You're going to learn more about that.
Great, thank you. I just want to just let everybody know here before I continue on with some more of the questions, 2 things. One, this is recorded and will be available for viewing on the encompasscare.ca website. It is in the resources section under the mental health communication series. So I just wanted to make that known to everybody, but we do have some more questions here and we have a bit more time. What is the impact of blue light on sleep patterns? And they're specifically talking about cell phone.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So the impact is actually that it turns off melatonin. So you see how we talked about this, melatonin begins to rise a couple of hours before our normal bedtime. And so when we're getting blue light, it is blue light in particular that is potent at turning off the melatonin signaling. Melatonin is actually a day length signal. That's what one of the things that melatonin's doing is it's tracking how long the solar day is. But we now have the advent of artificial lighting and electronics. Our LED backlit electronics are blue rich. And so we are altering our physiology, our programmed, our, you know, evolutionarily adaptive physiology. We're altering that by getting light at night. And as I mentioned, that is having a profound impact on our overall wellness as well as our performance.
All right. Will it help to have a nap between 1 and 4 before going to a 12-hour night shift?
Yes. So we will talk about this. Napping is beneficial when it's properly timed. There's a lot that goes into this, and we will cover that in the 3rd talk.
Okay, thank you. I think you've answered this, but if there's any difference, but how does taking Gravel affect every night affect the sleep cycle? Any different information on Gravel in particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I would tell you is that any drug or supplement, Sleepy Time Tea, any drug or supplement that has an impact on the neurotransmitter systems involved in sleep will have an impact on your sleep window. And again, you're right. What it's doing is it's going to impact one stage of sleep, driving that stage up, which will impact the other stages and impair them. So all of these things, we cover these in depth in talk number 2, but all of these have an impact. So to answer it generally, what I would tell you is that we have a sleep accountant, a physiological process that tracks our previous sleep-wake history, and our current day, determine no 2 days are the same, looks at our day and determines what sleep debt we have, what we need to get in terms of our sleep architecture. And any drugs that we take will have an impact on the sleep accountant's ability to balance those books. So that's the answer. But again, stay tuned for talk number 2. I will be showing you sleep data, Fitbit data, providing you with exactly how these drugs have an impact on sleep architecture.
Okay, thank you. I wake up every night at 2:30 and it takes at least a half an hour to go back to sleep. Is there a logical explanation for this?
Yes, it's called older adult sleep. And again, we talk about this in detail when we talk about why can't I sleep? Sleep changes is a normal course of aging. And one of the hallmarks is the ability to fall asleep and sustain sleep for about 3 to 4 hours, but then waking up and not being able to get back to sleep quickly. As we get older, you'll see this in the next talk, but as we get older, our ability to sustain sleep is weakened. And these awakenings through the night increase in frequency as well as duration. But as I mentioned earlier, and we did this with average age 88, and we were able to repair their sleep health. And that resulted in better overall performance, both cognitively and physically.
Thank you. So, you've talked about the fact that we're all essentially shift workers, but some are, more than others in that, many of the participants in this call are working shifts as it's required. How do we best protect ourselves if that's a requirement of the job?
Yes. And so I'm sorry for continuing to say this, but that's talk number 3 when we talk about circadian rhythms being the secret to our sleep health. And so we will be covering that in depth, both from a shift worker perspective, as well as an overall sleep health perspective. Keep in mind, I mean it when I say that we're all shift workers. Sleep's the first thing we sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance. And so we are altering our shift schedules, our sleep schedules, and that has, long-term implications. I will provide in that third talk, recipes for you to follow. I also have, as you know, Louise, a training program available online called Surviving Shift Work, designed specifically to address these things. We will be giving you as much as we can in a 1-hour talk, what you need to do. And if people have questions, they can reach out to me at glenn@elitesleep.ca. That's Glenn with 2 N's, GLENN @elitesleep.ca.
Thank you. Okay, lots of questions here around melatonin. Is that considered a sleep aid? Valerian root is another one.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's go to the melatonin. And what I want you to understand, and we will talk about this in talk number 3, but melatonin is a chronobiotic, meaning that it is a time cue for our circadian system. And the problem with taking melatonin, most people would take melatonin just before bedtime, a couple of hours, maybe 1-2 hours before they go to bed. And what happens is it will actually help you fall asleep. So it is a sleep aid in that sense. But the problem is that it'll cause you to wake up earlier. It causes a phase advance. It's like, now I'm here in Vancouver. It would be like me going from the point that it's digested, it's like me going from Vancouver to Toronto time almost immediately. And so for an individual, say, that's wanting to be able to fall asleep and sustain a healthy sleep window, an 8-hour sleep window, it will impair that ability because it causes you to wake up earlier and not be able to get back to sleep. So in the example of the older adult who can fall asleep but wakes up about 2-3 hours or within 3 to 4 hours after going to bed, and then not being able to get back to sleep, it's going to make that problem worse. So taking melatonin isn't the answer, but as we learn in talk number 3 to come, producing higher levels of melatonin naturally and protecting those levels by what we do in terms of our light exposure profile, our meal times, and our activity profile, promoting stronger circadian regulation and a natural melatonin profile and protecting it, that's the key to sleep health. So again, we will cover it in depth, but yes, melatonin is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, taking a pill isn't going to help you solve the problem.
Okay, I just want to let everybody know that any questions that we don't get to, Dr. Landry has agreed to answer those in follow-up, and we will post those with the session. So I have one last question. We have one minute left here. One last that I'll ask. It is, would things like a warm bath or hot tub, infrared sauna before going to bed help improve sleep by raising core body temperature and inducing sleepiness? Is this true?
Yeah, it does actually. So, and we will be covering that in talk number 3. But yes, increasing core body temperature with a warm to hot bath, but not too hot, can play a role. We definitely will be covering tips like that. So stay tuned.
All right, Dr. Landry, thank you so much. It's fascinating, and there's just so much to learn here. But I think what is really encouraging is that there are things that are within our control, even though there are, structural limitations perhaps in our lives, but definitely things that we can do to improve. So we look forward to learning more of that as we go along in the next sessions. So as you can all see, Dr. Landry is very passionate about this, and it's fabulous because it just impacts so many people, and I know it's particularly difficult for first responders.
Yes.
So that brings us to the end of today, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Landry, and we look forward to the next sessions, which are Wednesday the 25th from 1 to 2:15, where he focuses on why I can't sleep, and on Wednesday the 22nd, the same time, where Dr. Landry really focuses now on the kind of the secrets to sleep health there. And as I said, if there are questions, I'm just going to leave this window open a wee bit longer if you want to submit questions or reach out to the Encompass Care team for any questions. We will gather those, send those to Dr. Landry, and we will post those with this recording. So thank you, everybody, so much for your participation. And thank you again, Dr. Landry. Look forward to having you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.